Hello everybody, so as some of you will know who've been watching the previous videos, there's a group of brewers around the Bedford area who've come together to form Bedford Homebrew Group, which I've helped to organise and set up, and we've set out a programme for the year coming up of different themes or types of beer we want to brew for each meeting. The first one in January is going to be low ABV beers, and we've set ourselves a target of everyone brewing something that is at or below 3%, or as close as you can get to that target as possible. Now, a lot of people consider low ABV beers to be one of the most challenging things to brew there is, because obviously you're removing a large percentage of the stuff that gives beer its flavour, i.e. the malt and fermentables. So this video is just going to be all about my ideas and things that I've researched and found out about how you can potentially push that ABV down, but fingers crossed still produce a beer that's worth drinking. So let's find out if the theories work and see how the beer comes out at the end. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a few of the things that I've kind of looked into and some of the stuff that I've researched about how to do this, and have a little bit of brew day footage as well along the way. So I'm going to do this slightly differently to my usual kind of brew day footage. Hopefully it will work and you'll enjoy seeing it that way. But let's start off with fundamentally, you know, what low ABV beer means, and that's obviously a reduction in alcohol, which you can either achieve by just reducing the starting gravity or by increasing the finishing gravity, or if you combine the two, you can squeeze that final alcohol level down even further. Now, the most obvious and easiest way to do it is simply to take a recipe and cut drastically the amount of malt that's in there. So when you're looking at things like doing a low ABV beer using, for example, a party guile method, so you're taking the second runnings and then brewing that, you're going to start off with very low gravity and obviously have a much reduced final percentage as a result of that. If we want to make a beer that's still got a lot of flavour though, there's a bit of a pitfall there, because the malt, the grain, all the fermentables are what are giving you a lot of the flavour and the body of the beer. So my kind of thinking behind this is, obviously you're going to need to reduce the starting gravity a bit, but it's probably going to work a lot better if you also try and put a lot of focus on pushing up the final gravity, as well as slightly reducing the starting gravity. So I'm going to look at, fundamentally my main method for this is going to be to start off with a sort of fairly low gravity, so 1036 I think is the target, which is kind of your sort of ordinary bitter territory, which would often produce something between, say, 3.4 to 4%, I guess, with a lot of beers, depending on the yeast attenuation and what fermentables you're using. But I'm going to go for that sort of starting gravity, but then try and push the finishing gravity up by doing various things involving the mash and so on. But before we get to that, let's just start with what else you'd prepare for the beer. Now, water is always the thing that I start off with, and for the type of beer I'm going to do, which is going to be a fairly hoppy kind of pale ale type beer, the assumption is often that you will want to boost up the sulfate to give you that nice hoppy bite and crispness to the beer and so on. However, this is something where you need to maybe think a little bit outside the box, and I've read on a lot of forums that actually for low ABV beers, sometimes a better approach is to go the other way and boost up the calcium chloride levels in order to help emphasize the malt. Obviously, if you've got slightly lower levels of malt to start with, that's going to be a benefit, and also just to prevent that kind of drying effect that you get with sulfate. So high sulfate levels will tend to give you a drier beer, which is one of the reasons why it emphasizes the hop kind of crispness and bitterness. We don't want that necessarily. We want to maintain body in a beer that's likely to be quite dry anyway, if you've got a low starting gravity, and therefore a low finishing gravity. So we're going to go with higher chloride instead. Now, apologies for the hiss, the sparge water is actually heating up as we're doing this. So my water would start off with RO water because I'm using a pale ale, and then I use Beersmith to calculate a water profile of 50 ppm calcium, 50 ppm sodium, about 150 of chloride, a little bit of magnesium, just a sort of minimum level for that, and also a fairly high level of sodium as well. Now the reason again behind that, sodium is supposed to be quite good for emphasizing the flavor, so essentially the same as it does with food, it kind of seasons the beer a little bit. And my thinking is with this, perhaps with a lighter beer where you're a bit lower on the malt quantities, a good dose of sodium is going to help to just bring out the flavors there and give it a little bit more depth and body, hopefully. So that's it, yeah. So a slightly different approach in terms of the water profile. Then we get into the actual brewing, and we're looking at a mash temperature first of all, which is going to be right up towards the top end. So again, something you wouldn't normally associate with a kind of light pale ale, but in this case we want to push that FG as high as possible. So I'm going as far as I dare really, which is 71 degrees. Now as you'll see, I had a little bit of trouble hitting the temperature for that. I don't know whether it was because of the kind of low quantity of malt relative to the water or whatever, or just me not measuring stuff properly, but it seemed like the Beersmith prediction, which is normally pretty good, was a little bit out there, and I had to keep topping it up with boiling sparge water just to bring it up as close as I could to 71. I didn't even quite make it all the way up to 71 in the end, but I gave up and settled for 70.8, as you can see. So that in theory should, according to Beersmith, give me, with a starting gravity of 1036, a finishing gravity of about 1013. But I think it's actually going to finish higher than that, because I've found with Beersmith that when you go towards those very high mash temperatures, the predictions are usually a bit optimistic for the finishing gravity. So I'm thinking that that may go around 10, 15, 16 possibly. Although it depends a lot obviously on the attenuation of the yeast and how good that is at chewing through the more complex sugars, because those higher mash temperatures are making the more complex sugars, which are harder to break down for the yeast, more unfermentables in there, which should push up the final gravity. The yeast I'm using, I was planning on looking at WLP 002, because I know that that responds well to high mash temperatures and you can get quite a high finishing gravity with that anyway. I don't find it to be as low attenuating as it is said to be by White Labs themselves, but it still can give you a fairly high finishing gravity. I didn't prepare a starter though because I wasn't organised enough, so I'm going with SO4 instead, which I know is technically supposed to be a bit drier as an English ale yeast, but generally I find the English ale yeast do respond quite well to the higher mash temperatures, and SO4 has got a bit of a reputation for finishing a bit higher than people expect anyway, which a lot of the time I think maybe is down to mash temperatures being higher. So yeah, fingers crossed it will still work like that. Even if it does drop it down to 10-13, that would still only be 3.1%. So I think as long as my guess that it's actually going to be a little bit higher is right, we should be looking at about 3% or even slightly lower on the final gravity. That's also assuming that I've hit my target OG, of course, as well, because if that's a bit lower it will probably be beneath that anyway. We're talking about the mash, which should obviously lead us on to the grain bill. Now I've gone for a traditional English ale malt, so Maris Otter. I think it obviously makes sense to use something with quite a good depth of flavour, again because you're using a reduced quantity of it, so we want some good flavour from the base malt. But I'm supplementing it with 500 grams of Munich. Just adds body, I find, a little bit more colour as well, and is going to provide a bit more of that kind of dextrinous flavour too. A fairly good wedge of Cara malt, which is the sort of 30 EBC crystal malt. 300 grams of that, which equates to about 10%, so that's a fairly high dosage of crystal malt. But again, you want something that's going to potentially help push up the final gravity as well, because its crystal malts have more dextrins in them, and is also just going to give you a bit more sweetness and body to the flavour. Hopefully not too much, so we don't want it to be cloying, but with a beer that's quite well hopped as well, I think you can kind of balance out that caramel sweetness with the hops, and this has got a good portion of hops in there. Last of all, we've got 200 grams of melanoidin, which is renowned as a malt that will build body in a beer, and again is kind of like a intenser version of Munich and just provides you more of that kind of dextrinous sort of flavour and additional body in the beer. It's also good for just bringing a bit of colour, but we're mainly having it there for the kind of dextrins that's going to contribute and hopefully enhance the body of the beer, which could be lacking with that lower level of base malt to start with. With all of that, we've got some really nice hops going in. I'm doing it all late hopping, so we're looking at 10 grams of Galaxy and Mochuica at 10 minutes, 25 of each at 5 minutes, and then 75 grams dry hop, which will be split evenly between Citra, Galaxy and Simcoe. So it's a bit of a hop bomb for a beer that light. Again, I think you need to be a little bit careful that you don't overdo the hops in a very low alcohol beer, because they can just overpower everything. But that's what we're looking at, and hopefully those flavours are going to give me a really nice fruity beer at the end, and that hop flavour is going to again help to give the beer the character that we might otherwise be lacking if it's too thin and watery. There's a lot of balancing to be done here. I think it's quite a tricky one because of the you know, reduced starting gravity, so you want to be careful with the bitterness levels. I've only gone for 28 IBUs, which gives me a bitterness ratio of just under 0.8, which is a good starting point, I think, for pale ales generally, but we'll have to wait and see whether it's okay, because obviously dry hops are going to contribute a little bit of bitterness as well. Hopefully it won't be too overpowered by the hops. So the main things that we're looking at here to bring this gravity down are our starting gravity, pushing up the final gravity by using a higher mash temperature, in this case 71 degrees, looking at your yeast and thinking about maybe something that's a little bit less attenuative, or something that responds well to the higher mash temperatures. Again, SO4 wouldn't necessarily be the best choice usually, but I think that it will still work okay for this. WLP 002 would have been my first choice. Then we need to think about all the other little things that we could do. So I'm only doing a 40-minute mash with this. Sometimes the shorter mashes will help reduce the fermentability a little bit. Hopefully that will be the case. Other things that you could do, I'm sticking with kind of like a traditional, fairly traditional brew method here, but you could look at using some adjuncts like unfermentables, maybe some lactose or something like that, to kind of add the sweetness or body, or malted dextrin would be a good option as well, to kind of keep that body but not contribute any of the fermentable sugars that you don't want, because they'll obviously bring the ABV up. Obviously you want to avoid any simple sugars in a beer like this. I don't think you're going to get any benefit from throwing in, you know, sugar or adjuncts which are just contributing fermentables. It's just going to thin the beer out, and I think when you're starting with such a low gravity, you're probably going to run into problems there and have something that comes out far too weak and thin. So I would always, in my opinion, go with an all grain, all malt bill, unless you're going to add in those kind of adjuncts which are just there to build body without contributing fermentables. Right, so there she is, looking quite nice in the glass, if I do say so myself. Quite well carbonated, as you could see from that pour, and the head is quite persistent on this, so it's dropped down a little bit, but it's got a real nice kind of frothy cap on the top, which was something that I thought maybe would have suffered a little bit with the reduced size of the grain bill and everything, but seems to be okay. Aroma wise, there's some real kind of soft fruity notes coming off of it, which are really appealing. Difficult to pick out which hop is really coming through the most there, but there's some kind of peachy notes, I think, maybe kind of stone fruit thing going on. Not as citrusy as I might have expected with the hop bill, but yeah, pretty good. Very clear. That has been fined with gelatin, so I'm cheating slightly there, but it's been in the keg for about 3 weeks now, so let's give it a taste. So, flavour wise, the first thing really that I'm kind of happy with is the body on it is really good. So it's quite light, but it's not thin. It does seem to have a reasonably good mouthfeel and body to it. So on that front, the high final gravity and the malt bill and everything seems to have really paid off. The other thing that kind of gets my attention first of all is it's got a quite assertive bitterness to it. So I would say I was aiming for this to be more of a kind of pale ale, but this is, to me, bitterness wise, comes across more like a kind of IPA, or in this case I guess a session IPA. So it's quite pokey on the bitterness front, but it's not overwhelming. It was maybe a little bit harsh to begin with, but it has settled out a little bit more. But that's a nice antidote to the usual very low bitterness beers that tend to be dominant at the moment. So yeah, perhaps with the very low ABV you need to lower the kind of bitterness unit ratio a little bit more than you normally would. So I kind of worked on the same principle as I would with a normal gravity reading in terms of the bitterness units to gravity ratio. I think it was about 0.8, maybe something like that on this one. So perhaps bring that down a little bit. Maybe with the lower alcohol, it doesn't quite translate in the normal way to the finished product. But overall, I'm very happy with that. Quite drinkable. You wouldn't, as far as I'm concerned, guess that that was only 2.8% just by drinking it. Yeah, could maybe have got a little bit more fruitiness out of the hops. Perhaps that's another thing that the lower gravity makes it harder to do. I'm not sure, but overall, very happy, and I'll get a little bit of feedback on this tomorrow night at the brew club as well. So hopefully I'll put a little bit of that in at the end. Okay, so I took the beer down to the brew club the other night and got some good positive feedback on it, so that was really nice. Didn't take any footage in the end because I was too busy enjoying myself and drinking and talking bollocks, as you do, so apologies for that. But one thing I did bring back with me was one of these beers, which was by one of our members called Tony, and this was actually the beer that we all decided was the best one of the night. So reassuringly for me, a lot of the stuff that Tony did with this beer was along the same lines as what I did with my ones in terms of the brewing method and so on. So similar kind of mash temperature, starting gravity, and so on and so forth. Where this one worked a bit better than mine, I think, was just the sort of hopping levels on it. Bitterness was really spot on. He used Mosaic as the main hop, so he didn't have as complex a hop schedule as my one did, and I think the flavour from it was just a lot more kind of defined for that as well. So let's just pop this into the glass. He's got some funky little bottles that he brings to the brew club, but it's off the keg, so if you're about to comment about the clear glass and skunking, don't worry, it's only a temporary method for getting it to people from the keg. So yeah, lovely light beer, again, great clarity on it, nicely carbonated, and yeah, it's just packed with that Mosaic aroma, kind of dank, mango-y bit of citrus, a little bit of herbal note in there. And just as it tasted the other night, a really good beer. So cheers again for that, Tony. And it was nice to see that some of the things that I was talking about at length earlier in this video seem to have been supported by a beer that was produced using similar methods. So yeah, hopefully that will be useful to some of you. Sorry the video was a bit long. It seemed to be quite a lot to talk about in this one, but I would recommend, reading wise, if you want to look into this more, get the Session Beers book that I've put a link to down in the description, and that I mentioned earlier in the video, because that kind of covers a lot of the stuff that I talked about in detail, and was really helpful for me when I was making my beer. Don't know if Tony read that book as well, but if he did, maybe it helped with this one as well. So yeah, cheers guys.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness, or Duder, or, you know, El Duderino.